everyone. Welcome to my second episode of Around the Shop. We're working on the stock trailer still. I had a viewer that asked about brakes, and so I guess here's the brakes that I have on this trailer. Just your standard magnetic trailer brake. For those of you that don't know how these work, when you apply the brakes in your vehicle, it gives a rate of electricity to this magnet, which changes depending on what you have your brake controller set to and how hard you hit the brakes. Except for on older ones, it works off of G-forces on the G-forces inside of that brake controller. But the question was if I could show what I do when I replace the brakes or when I repair the brakes. And then this may not be the answer that you were looking for, but this is what I do when I work on trailer brakes right here. This is a whole new backing plate. You take the 5 bolts out that hold that old one on, and you bolt this one in place, and that is by far the best way to do it. There is really not a good reason to try and replace the brake shoes or anything like that in the old brakes, because as you can see on this one, everything else is rusty. The adjuster is rusty, and the springs are rusty, and everything just isn't worth screwing. It isn't worth the time it's going to take you to screw with trying to replace the pads and everything. Depending on where you get them, you can get these brake backing plates is what they're called. You can get these anywhere from $75 all the way up to, if you have a larger trailer, they can be $150, $200 for each side or for each axle. But yeah, and then on this trailer I only have brakes on the rear axle. I could add them on the front axle, but I would have to get a hub that's got the brake drum on it. But this is definitely the way to go. You get new wiring, everything, and you just bolt it right on. There's no adjusting or anything like that. So that's the way I like to do it. Now, as long as I've got this here, the wires aren't color coded. One is power, one is ground. It doesn't matter which is which. But something to keep in mind on a lot of trailers, and this one is the same way. The ground wire is just bolted onto the back of the backing plate or something like that. That is not how I like to do things. All of my LED lights that I added to this trailer, they all have a power and a ground wire. They're not the plastic lights that used to be riveted on here that had just a power wire and they ground through the frame of the light. I do not like doing it that way because it just opens it up for more failure. So what I like to do is I like to use these junction boxes, and that is a Phoenix product. We carry them at the shop I work at, and these are awesome. You find a nice location on the trailer to put it. It's watertight for the most part. I wouldn't submerge it, but it'll keep the crap out of there. And then you've got color-coded studs inside of there. These are made for like semi-trailers and whatnot. So they've got the 7 different colors that correspond with the different functions. So I will run all of my grounds from all of my lights. Maybe not a separate wire from each light, but I will run all of my grounds from my lights, all of my grounds from my brakes, all of my lights, all of my turn signals. Everything will get run to this junction box. And then I will have a 7-wire cable that comes from my hitch back to this junction box. The nice thing about that is if you're having issues, it gives you a really nice place to go and do some diagnostic work. You can check your powers and grounds and stuff like that at this box. If you get what you need there, your problem is somewhere back on the trailer. If you're not seeing what you need in this box, then it could either be your tow vehicle or something in that wire or the connector at the hitch of the tow vehicle. The other nice thing about this is if I decide I want to add some lights, or if I decide I want to, do anything like that, I can add them to these studs without cutting up the wiring that I've already got in this trailer. So often I see trailers where there's tap splices all over the place. Those are the ones where you put one wire through it and you stick your new wire in it and you squeeze it down with the pliers. In the mechanic world, they call those job security. So I hate seeing that on trailers. This one had a bunch of it when I started on it. So now you can just run wire back to this junction box instead. So these really do work great. I've got them all over the place on my trailers, on my tractor. Basically anywhere where I have lights on something like that, where I like to have a central place to run all those wires to. So I'm going to go ahead and get this backing plate off of here and get the new one bolted on and show you guys what it looks like when it's done. Alright guys, what you just saw there was a very incorrect way to get this hub off of that axle. But I knew that I was going to be replacing the brake backing plates and everything, so that didn't bother me. If you weren't going to be replacing these, if you were simply just servicing the bearings or wanted to take a look at your brakes, what you would actually have to do is you'd have to get on the back side in a situation like that. There's a little slot in the back of this backing plate, and you'd have to get in there with a brake adjuster tool, and you'd have to adjust these brakes so that the brakes can suck in. What happened there was my brakes were adjusted out. It was grabbing onto the little bit of the lip in my drum here, and I was unable to get the drum to come off of those brakes because they weren't fully released. The tensioner was stopping them from coming back any further. And so that's kind of a rare situation, but like I said, you can obviously tell that these brakes have been in here a long time because of the way they are. You can also tell that they haven't worked much in the amount of time that they've been in here because the pads actually still look pretty decent. But it is what it is. They only cost me $75 a piece for the backing plates. So get the new ones on there and keep them in good shape. But I'm going to go ahead and get this backing plate off. There's 5 bolts that hold it on the back side. Those bolts do have a knurling to them, much like the bolts in the suspension. What I found was when I tried to order them, the trailer parts place that I got some of the rest of my stuff, they didn't even have them in their warehouse. And so I don't know how important it is to actually have that flat-headed knurled bolt in there. So on the other side, I just put regular bolts, and then I put a nylon lock nut on the back side of it. So I'm going to do the same thing on this side, but the next step here is to get this old drum off. We'll probably clean some grease off of here. We'll get the old backing plate. We'll get that old backing plate off. We'll install the new backing plate, and then we can do the bearings in our hubs. So I'm going to keep you guys along for that, and let me know if you have any questions. Alright guys, now that you saw me take this drum off and the brakes and put the new brake backing plate on, I want to talk a little bit about the bearings, how this stuff all comes apart, and what to look for. So you saw in the earlier part of the video that there was a cotter pin in the castle nut. Castle nut comes off, there's a retaining washer that usually has a flat side on it to match the threads here. And then after that comes off, the hub is able to pull off. So then you can slide the hub off. Hopefully the brakes aren't a problem like they were for me. But once you do that, you're going to have your outside bearing is going to be loose. And so then what I look for is pitting, discoloration, things like that in the bearings. Here on this one, I've actually got some grooves. I'll hold it up to the camera here. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it, but if you look right at my fingertip there, there's actually some grooves in that bearing. Anything like that signifies to me that it's time for this bearing to be replaced. You can also look at the wear on the sides of the bearing cage. But usually what I look for is that pitting. Once I start to see that pitting, then I know there's been some heat. Discoloration will tell you the same thing, that there's been some heat. This one didn't have a lot of grease in it, so chances are that this one was running warm. And so we're going to go ahead and, I already bought bearings for all 4 sides anyways, because I like to have them all the same age. Next thing I'm going to show you quick is once you get that hub off, now obviously if you're dealing with a hub that doesn't have brakes on it, you're not going to have this big drum to work with here. But the next thing you got to do is there's an oil seal that wraps around that axle shaft right here that keeps the grease and stuff in there. It's a double lip seal. Now sometimes they come out pretty easy, sometimes they don't. This one is already halfway out, but I'm just going to take a simple hook bar, get in underneath there, and pry that out of there. It's a greasy, nasty mess once you get into this part of it, so be prepared for that. They do actually make a seal puller tool that you can use for that, but on these ones, they've come out pretty easy, so my regular old hook bar seems to have been working just fine. So after that point, you can pull the pull the bearing out of there, get things cleaned up, and then all that's left to do is remove your races, which is the next thing that I'm going to go over. So we'll catch up with you when I'm ready for that. All right, so here's the front hub off of that side of the trailer. You can see it doesn't have the big brake drum with it. It looks a little bit different. But this one I've got cleaned up a little bit. You can see that race in there. The race is what the bearing rides up against. It's actually the only part on the inside of the hub here that comes in contact with the bearing. Now, it is important that you replace this race every time you replace a bearing. You don't want to use an old bearing on a new race because they kind of wear together. I'm sorry, a new bearing on an old race because they do wear together. So you want to make sure you get that out of there. Now, there is a lip on the back side of it. So I could flip this over and get a punch on there, and I may be able to pound that out. Now, I've been finding on these specific ones, my guess is these bearings have been in here for a long time. The races don't just want to pound out for me. Sometimes you'll find that. Sometimes they quite literally just fall out when you take it apart. But what you do, if the races won't come out, is you take your welder and you actually just lay a beater on the inside of the race. Right on that race. What that does is it'll heat that race up, and it'll actually expand and then contract, and it'll give you the ability to knock it out of there. And so that's a little trick that we use to get these races out. You can use it in tons of different applications. Basically anywhere where you've got a bearing race inside of something that needs to come out, just lay a bead of weld around it like that. Then you can also use this race to kind of help pound the new one in. And that's why I've got this relief cut here, so that when I lay this on top of here and use it to pound the new race in, it doesn't get stuck in here. Otherwise, I'd pound it in there, it would be stuck just like the old one, and then I'd have to weld on it again, and then I'd wreck my new race. Keep in mind when you're welding on these races that it's okay if you have a little bit of splatter and stuff, because this race is the only part that contacts the bearing, and you're going to put a new one of these in there. The only place you'd want to be a little careful is up around the edges here where your bearing cap seals, and then on the other side where your dust cap or your double lip seal goes. But you can always file them out or grind them out if you have to. So I'm going to go ahead and I don't have a lens to put over the camera while I'm welding, but I'm going to go ahead and get the races out of this one, and then I'll show you guys how to pound the new ones in. Alright, I grabbed my other bearing right away too, so I don't have to dig for that and take my gloves off and do all that kind of stuff. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to take our grease, and you're just going to try and work it into that bearing as best you can. They do make tools for this, like bearing packer cones. We have one at the shop I work at. I don't have one here at home, so this is just got to do. And so I'm just kind of pushing that grease or rolling that grease down into the bearing. Everybody's kind of got different ways of doing this, but you just want to get grease in that bearing as much as you can. Alright, so this next step I've seen done many different ways. I'm just going to show you guys the way that I do it. Not that it's right, wrong, or otherwise. This is just what I like to do. This is where you preload the bearing. So I've got that washer back on there. I've got the castle nut back on there. My hub is on the bearings. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start tightening this nut. And as I'm tightening the nut, I'm going to continue to spin the hub. And it is going to get harder to spin, but then you should spin it and it'll loosen back up. And I usually get pretty aggressive with that part. Get it good and tight. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back that nut back off a little bit. And that gives my hub the ability to spin free without all that tension on there. So I'm going to back it off to the next slot in the castle nut typically. More if I have to. With this one I think we'll go one more. Basically what you want to do is you want to take some of that pressure off of there, but you don't want it so that the hub can slop back and forth front to back. I have noticed that the grease that I'm using is a little bit thicker than stuff I've used in the past. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but we'll see how it works. I'm gonna go grab a clip for this. Then all that's left is pounding that bearing cap on there. We can put the wheel back on, and that's really all there is to it. So thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please smash that like button, hit the subscribe button to see more, and check back for the next one. Thanks, guys.